The Sestina. The Sestina is another poem that uses repetition, like the Villanelle, but in a very different way. Its structure is again very rigid, very fixed. This one is longer. Sestina is a poem of 39 lines, and it's divided into 6 sestets, which you'll remember are 6-line stanzas, and 1 tercet, a 3-line stanza. They are usually written in iambic pentameter, though that is not set. However, the form is so set. I want to show it to you. It reuses the same 6 words at the end of the lines of every stanza. So instead of having a rhyme pattern, it has a word pattern. So instead of repeating sounds, you're repeating words. Now, when you're repeating words, it's different than repeating sounds. If we're just repeating sounds, then it's just a phonetic ideal that we're trying to copy. If we're repeating words, then we're repeating meaning. Sometimes when words are repeated, they can mean something different in the first place that they were used as in the second place. And that's the brilliance of the Sestina. The Sestina is divided up like this. Here are the stanzas, and instead of lowercase letters to signify rhyme, we're going to use uppercase letters with no numbers. So remember, a lowercase letter is for a rhyme that's repeated. An uppercase letter with a number is for an entire line that's repeated, and an uppercase number on its own is for a word that is repeated. Here we have word pattern. In the first stanza, A, B, C, D, and F are set words. These words cannot change throughout the poem. They are set in the first stanza going in order. In the second stanza, the order is changed. However, that word A in the first stanza is the same word A in the second stanza, as well as the third, as well as the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and on the envoy. The word cannot change. All the other words in the lines are free to be whatever they want to be. But the poet must come back to that same word at the end of the line. And the genius of the Sestina is just what I said before. The way that the words are used in the beginning will change throughout the poem. Towards the end, it will mean something a little different. And that's why these forms are extremely hard to craft well by modern poets. Sometimes it gets discouraging because they're so restricting. But they're also a really good practice about form. Let's read a really good example of a Sestina. This one is called Sestina, and it's by Elizabeth Bishop. September rain falls on the house. In the failing light, the old grandmother sits in the kitchen with the child beside the little marble stove, reading the jokes from the almanac, laughing and talking to hide her tears. Now, we know that the form of this stanza has to follow this pattern, which means the last lines of every line are fixed. Now, we can expect to see these same exact words at the ending lines of the other stanzas. Of course, the order is going to be mixed according to the form I showed you earlier. Let's go to the next stanza. She thinks that her equinoctial tears and the rain that beats on the roof of the house were both foretold by the almanac, but only known to a grandmother. The iron kettle sings on the stove. She cuts some bread and says to the child. So again, we have the same last words. And yet somehow the poet has crafted a movement in the story. We see a scene here between a grandmother and a child in a house on a stove. And even though the poet is using the same words, we're getting closer to a movement in a story. Let's continue. It's time for tea now, but the child is watching the tea kettle's small, hard tears dance like mad on the hot black stove, the way the rain must dance on the house. Tidying up, the old grandmother hangs up the clever almanac. Again, we see the same words used in a different pattern, but the action of the poem is still continuing. There's not a complete narrative here where we're going to see a beginning, middle, end, and a resolution, as we do with most novels and plots. But there is a movement, there is a scene that's being shown, and there is a movement of characters towards some resolution. Let's continue. On its string, bird-like, the almanac hovers half open above the child, hovers above the old grandmother and her teacup full of dark brown tears. She shivers and says she thinks the house feels chilly and puts more wood in the stove. We identify the same last words. But now the grandmother who was in the beginning of the poem, who seemed to be the strength of the house and taking care of the child, now in the third stanza we see her suffering. We see her having the tears. Let's continue. It was to be, says the marvel stove. I know what I know, says the almanac. With crayons the child draws a rigid house and a winding pathway. Then the child puts in a man with buttons, like tears, and shows it proudly to the grandmother. Now, I want to point out a couple of things here. Always, the last words are still at the end of the line. However, in this line, it was to be, says the marvel stove, and I know what I know, says the almanac, are examples of personification, where we attribute human qualities to inanimate objects. Specifically here, not animals, but a stove and an almanac is speaking. So that's an example of personification. And more directly to the theme, now we see the objects in the house have a power that the grandmother doesn't. Let's see how this poem ends. But secretly, while the grandmother busies herself above the stove, the little moons fall down like tears from between the pages of the almanac into the flower bed the child has carefully placed in front of the house. Time to plant tears, says the almanac. The grandmother sings to the marvelous stove, and the child draws another inscrutable house. So again, we have an example of personification, and the final last words that are indicated at the end is the envoy, which is known as the send-off or the goodbye, which is why the last stanza is a tercet, repeating only the certain letters A, C, E, representing those words that were repeated in the poem. You'll really have to review these forms. Because they are so different and yet a little similar to each other, you'll want to write them down and study them, and have a couple of favorite examples of yours. An example of a villanelle that you like, an example of a sestina that you find entertaining, because this will help you remember for the test. Poetry is about form, it is about structure, and you will be asked to recognize those elements on the exam. So please, look at the reading list and make sure that you read the poems and study the forms and review these lectures. Also, do the practice questions so that you know that you're correctly answering the questions ahead of time. This way you'll do better on the test.